you. At last year's conference of the BSANZ in Sydney, I reported on my current project, the Letters of Charles Harper and His Circle, a printed book then nearly completed as a spin-off from the Charles Harper Critical Archive, or CHCA, as I'll call it. Its archival phase was published in 2019. But last year, I felt the need to explain why, after a quarter century of experimenting with digital edition projects, I was pushing forward to a print edition of letters yet again. And I said, first, these were the reasons. First, because the act of printing an edition of Harper's letters will likely bring him readers that an online archive, especially a scholarly one, would not achieve. Second, because I don't trust the digital form to have permanent accessibility. And third, because print forces you to bring the project up to a uniformly high standard of accuracy for the simple reason that you only get one chance to get it right. Psychologically, this makes sense as an incentive, and it lets you get on with your life afterwards. Online projects, in contrast, many of them at any rate, just seem to hang around, full of high potential but inherently unfinished, until they finally run out of funding or commitment, or both. Digital projects are for the very patient and the hopeful, although of course they potentially do many things that books can't do and contain an amount of data that your average book publisher would blanch at. Well, that was where I was up to with my thinking last year. What I hadn't anticipated were the effects on this assessment of my subsequently reading successive sets of proofs of the book from May to September this year. I worked with my co-editor, Chris Venning, whose principal role it had been to prepare the annotation. We separately proofed the front matter and all the letters and annotation in the conventional way. Then we read every page of all 200 letters aloud to one another, one of us having proofs of the edited reading texts in hand, and the other gazing intently, quizzically, eye-bogglingly closely at digital facsimiles of the original manuscripts preserved in the Mitchell Library. I'd done that oral checking often enough in the past with the proofs of the Academy Editions of Australian Literature series, despite the very considerable editorial labour that had preceded it. If you had 5 versions, now you had 5 readers. This time, with the Harper letters, we typically only had one version of each letter, but there were multiple hands, since the letters are those of Harper and his circle, not just his alone. Some of the writers were not fully literate. Punctuation, spelling, and abbreviations could be highly eccentric, and even Harper himself was a poor speller, also often using 18th century spellings that were still acceptable in his day. A historical documentary edition needs to mediate between the irregular habits of writers and what inconsistency modern readers can tolerate. That mediation is spelled out in an editorial policy, such as you're looking at, that describes or lists in detail what silent categories of emendation were implemented. There need to be predictability and consistency in the very inconsistency of the materials edited. This is how the editor respects the historical witness of the documents. It's not a case of anything goes. Every irregularity needs to be assessed against the evolving editorial policy, the statement of which is typically the last thing to be finalised in a scholarly edition because it is continuously involved in a feedback loop with the actual editing. The textual editing of the Harper letters was carried out in a newly written online editing environment that now forms part of the ecdosis tools behind the CHCA. Desmond Schmidt was the software engineer. By the way, the fuzziness of that letterbook copy on the left-hand side there is exactly as the document is in the Mitchell Library. The initial transcription of each letter was placed in a right-hand window. The facing left-hand window contained the corresponding facsimile image. In the right-hand window, you could then create a newly edited version of what we now, you could then create in the right-hand window a newly edited version of our original transcription, and you could go backwards and forwards between the edited version and what we call the archival version, correcting and coding as you pleased. The aim of the archival version was just to retain fidelity to the document, whatever the outcome, including, as far as we could, the irregularities of its layout. Whatever we couldn't capture due to the restricted nature of the allowable codes in the editing environment, we could at least be sure that the ultimate user of the edition would be able to work it out for themselves by consulting the facsimiles. No encoding system could precisely capture all their peculiarities. For example, different systems of end-of-line hyphenation or of superscript final letters in Mr. and Mrs. with dots or underlining or none below the raised letters. Provision of an addressee's name at the foot of the first page would be matched in the archival version, but with the edited version, now destined for a print and digital environment, it could no longer be fully dependent on the original manuscript, and specifically not on its page breaks. We were obliged to shift the addressee's name to the letter to the letter title, and generate a silent category of emendation to describe this general change. The destined digital environment was prefigured by another facility within Ecdosis, where you could place annotations on the left against the edited version of the letter on the right, live linked to one another. This organization of content, later processed by a style sheet, meant we could ultimately generate automatically an ebook of the whole collection of selected letters, 200 of them in our case, together with their annotations, and then export the whole thing into HTML, or in fact into Word. Sounds ideal, doesn't it? It's just what Peter was asking for at the very end of his paper. The online edition, where edited versions of the letters would be presented individually, whether against facsimiles or annotations, would be identical to the versions printed in the book. We'd have the best of both worlds, the perfect transformation to invoke the theme of our conference. Although we didn't stop to ask why exactly we wanted this. In the end, and for practical reasons alone, this quixotic editorial desire proved impossible to satisfy. The impossibility explains the title of my paper, The Prodigal Returns. That is, returns to the fold, or really to the land of the folded sheet. It all flowed from the production process. This is the explanation. Ecdosis works on a principled rejection of TEI encoded XML, of the hierarchies XML enforces, and the very broad array of codes that TEI countenances. An editorial project normally chooses a subset of those codes in order that software can be written that can process the codes via a style sheet responsive to them. No software could endure the whole specification of codes that scholarly editions of early and modern materials require, if only because when it comes to tricky or ambiguous situations in handwritten manuscripts especially, no two encoders will interpret the codes identically, which explains why there are silos of XML TEI all over the world awaiting the online messiah. Ecdosis is not hampered by XML's hierarchies. Nevertheless, it works best and most predictably, and thus allows for subsequent reprocessing if the number of its codes, both for content types and for layout, are kept to a minimum. Well, that seemed fine to me in prospect. I reasoned that the subtler details of text and layout could be settled after export to the public-facing CHCA website as an ebook, and then, as we hoped, for print, without compromising the texts. Well, that expectation turned out to be naive. There's that word again. Online scholarly editing environments are not like commercial word processors that have benefited from the joint efforts of scores of programmers perfecting them over tens of years. Consistency online is very possible. Indeed, it is enforced, but flexibility and sensitivity to the vagaries of the human hand on the original documents are far harder to achieve. Fortunately, Desmond figured out how to export the ebook into Word, the format that our print publisher was now calling for. Getting down to work in the Word environment after the export of the ebook gave me my first real chance to check things properly. I'd done my best in the online environment, but had often felt frustrated and had just had to hope for the best. I realise now that in Word, I could see things. I could see things clearly. The pink text boxes in Ecdosis were no longer constraining. In Word, I could generally make things go more or less where they should go. Problems of end-of-line hyphenation left over from the export could be sorted out. The placement of the successive lines of the sometimes elaborate complementary close of letters could be clarified in a more meaningful way. But alarmingly, many errors were now only spotted in our work for the first time, and others were left over from the online editing, which had often resisted my initial efforts to correct them and been lost sight of as Desmond struggled to find time to resolve the general problem that each case brought to light. There was, for instance, a clunkiness about saving in Ecdosis. If you move, say, across the screen from the text on the right, where, say, you were positioning a hyperlink to a note, to trimming annotation on the left within the same letter, well, if you did so and immediately saved, then all was well. But as often as not, a correction would remind you of an earlier instance that now needed correcting too, or of a similar gloss in another letter that now had to be reconsidered. But if you left the present letter to do this without saving first, just as you naturally would within a large Word document without loss, then the corrections you had just made would be lost, and you wouldn't realise they had been. This was not a logical fault of the program, but rather a failure on the part of the operator, the all-too-fallible me, who had naturalised Word's procedures over very many years. Furthermore, online, when switching from one letter to another, you would use a drop-down menu that gave you access to all the letters via date. Now, while using that menu, I was continually tripped up by undated letters for which a provisional or very rough dating had been given during the original transcription phase, pending the editing. But I was now doing the editing and often redating such letters, but without the power to change their online metadata and thus their position in the list. So now, as I worked, some letters had in effect conflicting dates. For the printed book, this is, of course, a crucial matter, since letters need to be sequenced chronologically, anticipating readers who want to read the letters seriatim, rather than as extracted individually one by one from a drop-down menu. The two encounters are very different. The latter kind of online reader is looking for a particular letter with some factual or other question in mind. This meant, in turn, that the annotation provided for each letter for that reader needed to be complete. But the book reader doesn't want to be told who Henry Parkes is, his dates, his shifting political allegiance and cultural roles every time he makes an appearance. In the book, explaining once is generally enough, and the index or a brief cross-reference can point any reader who doesn't read from the beginning to the relevant main entry for Parkes. This is why there was so much trimming in the online phase of the editing, where originally we had assumed every letter had to be self-sufficient. I must have scalped 20,000 words of Chris's notes, eliminating repetition in this way. There was a lesson here. That's Parkes, young and old. There was a lesson here that began to dawn on us as we moved to the newly generated Word file, although it seemed deeply counterintuitive at first. It was that in our working methods, we should henceforth treat all readers as if they were reading a book, or at least a stable PDF. Online readers' access to the letters, their route through the archive, was so unpredictable, we concluded, that perhaps such readers should editorially just be ignored. That's Harper, towards the end of his life. Trying to cater for online readers had led to endless repetition that was likely to be annoying for readers of multiple letters in whatever medium they encountered them. Desmond then suggested what he thought was the logical solution: a glossary of persons mentioned in the letters that could be linked to every appearance in a letter of any particular person. But I saw that would have only created a range of new problems, especially for principal personages who appeared throughout the collection, such as Parkes, such as Daniel Dennehy, N.D. Stenhouse, Henry Kendall, Harper family members, and preeminently Harper himself. Generalized information is not helpful. In fact, it is annoying if you have a particular query raised by the letter you are reading. If the gloss were to cover every one of these likely queries, then many entries would bulge into encyclopedia articles, only tiny parts of which would be relevant to the letter you are currently looking at. I concluded this strategy was neither feasible nor desirable. There's no substitute for the kind of gloss that printed books encourage, that is nicely molded to the uncertainty in the text, that is aware of the immediate context and is expressed with utmost economy. In other words, the book does it better. It's as simple as that. We learned this lesson the hard way. There are implications that I'll now describe. For one thing, it led us to a further awakening, one that sits well with the whole approach of the CHCA. I've argued in the past that we can employ a conceptual slider to organise our thinking about scholarly aims when dealing with documents. Imagine a slider as running between archival activity, which sits to the left on the slider, and editorial, which sits to the right. The more document-oriented your current activity as collector, binder, cataloguer, the more archival it is. And thus your activity ranges to the left on the slider. But then initial transcription of the document qua document, rather than as container of works and versions, nudges you ever so slightly to the right. Then going further, the more textually interpretative and reader-oriented your activity becomes, the more editorial it is. Thus, your activity ranges even further to the right on the slider. Because the two activities or impulses always remain in close relation to one another, the difference between the two domains is never pure or absolute. The archive anticipates the edition depends upon the archive. With the Harper letters, we'd been trying to run the archival and the editorial together, whereas what we needed to do was, in our working methods, to acknowledge their difference. The solution was staring us in the face, but before I spell it out, let me once again return to the job we had in hand. So after the online stage, as I said, I began working in Word on screen, where all the letters became accessible simultaneously in the one document just by scrolling. No menu intervened. I was correcting, checking against the facsimiles whenever I saw something odd that might stand in need of correction or emendation, and I was further trimming the annotation as I went. But soon I felt the urge to switch to paper. And when I did, I suddenly felt even more in control. I now had an easier capacity to survey the whole, to move backwards and forwards at will by flipping the printed pages. I found I had a better memory for what was on those pages. I found things I was looking for intuitively, usually without being distracted by search software. When we thought the Word files were final, we submitted them to Sydney University Press, where, after several trial typesettings to settle on a page design and a rough typesetting for the whole 200 letters, which was that typesetting done only to ascertain whether they would all be contained within the allowable page extent. Well, they did, but only just. First proofs were then produced in tranches in the typesetting software InDesign. Codes had been imposed in Ecdosis for the complementary opening and close of each letter, and for the address, for the date, for quoted poetry, for the PS, if any, and for any contemporary filing notes added in other hands, as often in official correspondence. All of these had white space around them that the codes available to me in Ecdosis wouldn't let me control online. The conversion into Word adjusted them into something like print normality, but at page turnovers in Word, these extra spacings remained all but invisible. Unfortunately, our documents sent on from the publisher to the typesetter were given no other copy editing than mine. So it was that a certain airiness that I now slightly regret crept into the typeset first proofs. I only recognised it as a problem, indeed a small one to be sure, but I only realised it when it was too late to request changes, since it would throw out the whole typesetting, finely adjusted as it had become in getting potentially widowed and orphaned material to sit acceptably on the page. Other than that, I'm happy with the result. The hundreds of years of print shop experience that have fed into word processing and computer typesetting software that now give us control over the page, almost to the level of the pixel, is truly something to celebrate, whereas books that are output from TEI encoded XML files or from ecdosis codes are clunky in comparison. Now, I imagine at this point, some of you will be muttering, is not this celebration of the book a putting of our heads in the sand, a willful ignoring of digital power and the potential for reuse of the data? I've thought about this objection and have to say, my experience doesn't bear it out. The solution I've been promising to reveal will explain why. I'll get there by considering those InDesign proofs. When Chris Venning and I received them, we printed them off and, as I described before, read them aloud to one another against digital facsimiles of the manuscript letters. I was aghast at the number of remaining errors we winkled out at that stage. It was hearing the texts, internalising them through hearing them, that provided the remedy, the very old-fashioned remedy, for the various software and coding restrictions and the mechanical failures on my part that editing online had brought with it. And having heard them, we could now see them for the first time. Somehow print gave us the imagination to see them as problems of presentation for our readers. Our readership came to the forefront of our minds. Our efforts were shifting to the right along that slider as we worked. Unfortunately, the net result of this textual journey was that some hundreds of corrections in total of error and of layout adjustments to suit the evolving editorial policy had to be made either at word or proof stages. There was therefore no real chance of going back and repairing the edited reading texts in ecdosis. I soon realised that it would be far too fiddly and would only introduce new opportunities for error. I recognised, and not for the first time, that scholarly edition production is a one-way track. The problem is fixed now for print, but the experience has been chastening all the same. In effect, we have abandoned the online edition that we had intended because of the production necessities of print. The facsimiles and the archival transcriptions will remain online, but with no claim to editorial status. The online edited reading texts and their annotation became superseded, as I described, and in fact have been abandoned. Users who get interested in the archival forms of the letters will find them online or on the CHCA site. If they want to go further, they will soon see that an edition is also available for the letters, both in PDF and print forms, that present the letter texts according to argued principles and that interpret the letters. In relation to the edition, the online presence will therefore play an only supplementary role, but an indispensable one all the same. This is because of the range of layout and other presentational features endemic to the manuscripts that the edition is deliberately not reporting. The archives performing this role via its facsimiles makes the print edition less encumbered for the first-time reader, while leaving the evidence in place for the dedicated scholar who wants to know. For instance, whether the less lettered writers unable to master punctuation were using the indistinct stops we found between words, as you can see them there, stops between words as a series of breath pauses. Is that what they are? Well, if they were doing so, we found we could not detect the system at work. But the archival evidence remains easily available online via the facsimiles for the historian of punctuation or of education who is better informed in this area than we are. The more you push this distinction between the archival presence and the editorial one, the more you bring the slider into conscious use to guide your understanding of your present dealings with the documents, dealings that can change day to day. The clearer everything gets. Once the archival materials are accessibly and flexibly in place, the edition becomes recognizable as an application of them. a presentation that is informed by interpretation and argument about them. And of course, of arguments there can be no end, but of relevant archival materials from the past there definitely is. The edition is but one fulfillment of their potential. So, in conclusion, in the meantime, this returning prodigal to the land of the folded sheet, me, after 25 years of tinkering with the electronic and then digital scholarly edition projects, is throwing in his lot with the book, the scholarly edition, albeit with an evolved conception of it that respects the need for a complementary online archival presence. I imagine these two outcomes as taking up their position on that slider, which makes me think I know what I'm doing now and why I'm doing it. And that is a considerable consolation. Thank you.